My name is Jocelyn Hart. I'm 31 years old. She's a fraud, a military imposter in uniform. My father's voice cut through the air like a scalpel, deliberate, cold, and far too calm for how violent the accusation felt. It happened during my commendation ceremony. I stood on stage in full dress uniform, a fresh medal clipped to my chest, my name still echoing in the air from the last line spoken. The applause had just died down when he stood up from the front row. Colonel Richard Hart, retired. My father. I know this woman, he continued louder now, as if explaining something inconvenient to a slow audience. She is not who you think she is. She never earned that commission. She never belonged in that uniform. All eyes turned to him, then to me, waiting for denial, tears, rage, something. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I stood in full posture, gaze, steady shoulders squared. And then, from the far end of the room, a general rose, walked toward my father. He leaned in, whispered one word. My father's jaw slackened, his hands lowered, and the entire room went pale. I stood there beneath chandeliers and flags, surrounded by an audience that didn't really know who I was. Not yet. But they would, because this wasn't the first time I'd been dismissed. It might, however, be the last. Walk with me through the quiet to see who I became and what became of the man who thought I was only a soldier by name. I didn't blink. Not because I was being stoic or trying to appear unshaken, but because blinking would have broken something in me, something holding everything else still. The room around me felt carved from stone. Even the air stopped moving. Somewhere in the back, someone dropped a program booklet. The paper rustled oddly loud in the silence. I heard my own breathing then. It sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. The general who had whispered into my father's ear now stood a few paces behind him, arms crossed behind his back. The word he'd said, I didn't hear it, but I saw it land, like a missile that left no smoke but rewired the terrain. My father sat down. That was the first surprise. He didn't huff or argue or pretend to clarify. He just sat, slowly. The expression on his face wasn't guilt or shame. It was fear, quiet, dense fear. No one clapped. No one moved. The MC, a young captain, cleared her throat like it physically hurt. "Let us proceed," she stammered, but her voice cracked in the middle of it. I turned slightly toward her, not fully just enough to signal continue. Let the script recover what the room could not. She did. I walked the last few steps of the stage back into line with the others, other recipients, some lower-ranked, others more senior. I felt them watching me, unsure whether to lean in or pull away. I didn't mind the confusion. It was better than judgment. The rest of the ceremony happened in pieces. An award for operations excellence. A few soft speeches. But the weight never lifted. It hovered above us like humidity before a storm, invisible but heavy. And at the center of it was me, not because I'd said or done anything out of line, but because I hadn't, and because the man who'd just accused me was my father. Afterward, during the awkward milling that follows every formal event, officers shaking hands without conviction, family members folding napkins for no reason, I stood beside the refreshment table, untouched fruit trays behind me, water bottle still capped in my hand. People passed me, but no one quite approached. Not at first. A civilian woman, probably a spouse or cousin of one of the honorees, gave me a sympathetic nod. A junior lieutenant I didn't know looked like he wanted to speak, then thought better of it. My commanding officer, Colonel Avery, came close, smiled with something almost like pride, and said only one thing. "Good posture. Always." I nodded. I scanned the room. My father was gone. Slipped out before the program ended. No goodbye, no second glance. I don't know if he even looked back when the general whispered to him. I don't think he needed to. The message was clear. The room was beginning to move again, small circles of conversation returning cautious and quiet. But I stood still, because somewhere deep down I wasn't sure which felt worse. The fact that my father thought I was a fraud, or that part of me had been bracing for this all along. I didn't cry in the car. I drove myself back to base quarters, removed my gloves with care, unpinned my badge, folded the commendation folder, and slid it into the drawer with the others. The ceremony didn't feel like a victory, but it didn't feel like defeat either. It felt like a shift. Something had broken. Not me, not really, but something around me. A weight that had always been present, hiding under duty and performance and obligation. The need to be seen, to be accepted, to earn love through proof. It cracked the moment he stood and said, "She's a fraud." Because I realized he never looked at me. Not really. Just the idea of me. And he hated what didn't match his vision. But the general had. He looked. He saw. And one word had been enough to shift the power in the room. I didn't know what that word was. Not yet. But I would find out. And when I did, it would change everything. I was 8 years old when I first heard the phrase bloodline of duty. It came from my father naturally. He'd say it when introducing himself at reunions, shaking hands with fellow officers at community functions, or posing beside his military shadow box in the den. "I come from a bloodline of duty," he'd say, shoulders drawn high with pride, "and I expect it to continue." He never said it to me directly. But he didn't need to. It lived in the spaces between his questions. The way he'd ask, "Is that the uniform you chose when I came downstairs in my ROTC attire?" Or the way he'd scan my report cards, not for the grades, but for the categories, his gaze landing harder on the words leadership, discipline, initiative than anything else. Colonel Richard Hart wasn't abusive. He didn't yell or drink or disappear. He was always there. Always, hovering just enough. His expectations weren't a burden, they were a structure. And I lived inside them like a well-built cage. My mother had passed when I was 6. Cancer, quiet fast. After that, it was just us, and silence took up the extra space in the house. A silence I learned to read like a second language. We didn't talk about feelings. We talked about plans, goals, benchmarks. If I cried, it was in the shower. If I succeeded, it was noted with a nod, not a hug. By high school, I had perfected the art of achievement. Straight A's, top of my class in JROTC, state track championships, debate club. And yet there was always the pause, the look in my father's eyes like he was measuring whether I had truly earned it or if the system had just been kind to me. "Don't expect special treatment," he'd say. Not as a woman, not as my daughter. I never did. But I think I expected some recognition. Just a little. When I got into the academy, I told him over dinner. I waited for the pride, that spark of genuine emotion. He simply said, "We'll see if you make it through plebe year." I did. And every year after that. At 24, I was commissioned. By 28, I was leading logistics operations for overseas deployments. I never once asked for his approval. But every time I saw him at family functions or base events, I'd study his expression like a code I couldn't crack. Sometimes I wondered if he wanted me to fail, not because he hated me, but because he needed the story of Hartman to remain intact, and I didn't fit that headline. My cousins, the boys, had all fizzled out. One dropped out of OCS. One became a contractor, never enlisted. One simply opted for law school. That left me, and somehow that seemed unacceptable to him, as if my success was a mirror turned back on his legacy, showing not pride, but disruption. By the time I turned 30, we barely spoke. Birthday calls were short. Thanksgiving was polite, but hollow. He never asked about my deployments, never referenced my field work or command reviews. But he always read my name in the defense newsletters, I knew that. He followed quietly and critically. I learned to live without his approval, but I hadn't learned to stop wanting it. Which is why, when he stood up during that ceremony, when he spoke with such certainty that I was a fraud, it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a culmination, a final chapter in a story that had always been heading here. Because if there's one thing worse than being invisible to the person who raised you, it's being seen and misnamed. He saw me, but not as a soldier, not as an officer, only as the woman who somehow took up space in a lineage that was supposed to be masculine, traditional, and tightly scripted. I spent most of my life trying to prove I belonged, and in that moment on stage, I realized I never would. Not to him. The week after the ceremony was strangely quiet. No formal debrief, no phone call from command about what had happened. It was as if the incident had been folded away into the ceremonial script filed under unfortunate disruption, but never officially acknowledged. Not by the unit, at least. But whispers have their own kind of oxygen. They don't need signatures to spread. By Wednesday, I felt it. The eyes in the hallway that lingered just half a second longer. The officers who shifted mid-conversation when I entered the room. The text from a junior lieutenant I knew him only vaguely that read, "Sorry about your dad." That was brutal. No punctuation, no follow-up. In meetings, I was included, but just barely. My reports were taken, but not discussed. People were polite, always polite, but that courtesy held an edge as if I'd become a delicate subject best handled with gloves. The truth was, I had done nothing wrong. My record was clean, my performance above average. But none of that mattered once my credibility had been questioned, especially by someone like him, a decorated veteran, a father, a man. Even a lie feels legitimate when it's delivered in uniform. I kept my posture. I went to the gym early before the others arrived. Ate alone, spoke only when necessary. Not because I was retreating, but because I needed the silence not for protection, but for calibration. To keep myself from erupting in any direction that might validate his accusation. Fraud. The word itself echoed louder than any slur. It wasn't about skill or strength. It was about identity. It suggested that everything I had done, everything I had endured, was artifice. And no one stood up to defend me. No one challenged him, except the general, and even he had spoken only one word. It turns out that was enough to shut my father down, but not enough to erase the seed he had planted. It grew in the corners of every room I walked into. One morning, I overheard two officers talking near the copy machine. One said my name, then hesitated. The other chuckled, said, "Well, I mean, you never really know how someone got promoted, right? I didn't confront them. I simply noted it, folded it away like a memo I'd file later. Because if I responded to every shadow, I'd become the ghost they already assumed me to be. The hardest part wasn't the cold shoulders or the rumors. It was the silence from people I trusted. I had friends, mentors, people I'd deployed with eaten rations beside bled with in training. I expected, perhaps naively, that one of them might say something, might pull me aside and ask, "Are you okay? Or do you want me to say something, or just—" That wasn't right, but no one did. Even those I respected most defaulted to caution. Because once someone questions your legitimacy and does so with a microphone, you become radioactive. To be near me was to risk something, so most stayed quiet. Even my direct superior, a fair and competent commander, kept her feedback strictly professional. No mention of the incident, no check-in, just assignments, schedules, signatures, and still, I said nothing, because I wasn't afraid of the judgment. I was afraid that defending myself would be seen as confirming doubt. I had learned early that women in uniform are always one volume setting away from being labeled emotional, so I chose the safest one, quiet. But quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet is where pressure builds, where decisions form not out of rage, but out of clarity. I began to take mental notes, not about people who disliked me, those were obvious, but about those who abandoned neutrality when it mattered. People who prided themselves on fairness until fairness required action. That was the true loss. Not my father's reputation, not my standing, but the realization that the institution I had given so much to all my energy, my youth, my identity, could be hijacked in a single moment by a man with an old badge and a loud voice. It would have been easier if someone had just said it plainly. Maybe he's right. Because then, at least, I'd know the battleground. But what I faced was worse. The unspoken suspicion that lingered like fog, too thin to confront, too thick to ignore. I was a fraud, not because I was, but because someone said it and no one said otherwise. The hardest part about losing your reputation is realizing how little of it was ever yours to hold. That month, I started waking up before my alarm, not because I had energy, but because my mind refused to rest. I would lie there in the gray quiet of 0440, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember who I used to be before that stage, before his voice shattered something invisible and essential. I wasn't angry. Anger would have been cleaner. What I felt was more like erosion, a slow, continuous peeling away of certainty. I began to question everything, not just what people thought of me, but what I thought of myself. Did I deserve my last promotion? Did I really earn that commendation, or was it a fluke? Was my leadership style too soft, too careful, too invisible? Those questions weren't new, but they were louder now, and in the absence of voices to challenge them, they began to sound like truth. I thought about transferring out. I even drafted the request once, cursor blinking beside the words for personal and professional clarity. But I never hit send. Somewhere inside, I was still trying to hold the line. But my body was telling another story. I skipped lunch. I trained harder not to grow stronger, but to feel something tangible, something that didn't depend on approval. I turned down social events, invitations, calls. I didn't want to be asked how I was, because I didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound like a lie. The tipping point came strangely, not from a confrontation, but from a form. An anonymous evaluation form was passed around the unit, part of a routine morale check. I'd seen dozens of them before. I filled it out without thinking, but a week later, someone in the admin office accidentally left a box unattended open on a side table. I wasn't snooping, I just saw my name. One comment, handwritten. She seems competent, but it's hard to trust someone whose own father called her a fake. I stared at it for a long time. My name. That sentence. No signature, no context. Just fact floating on a piece of paper. It hit harder than the public humiliation. Harder than my father's words. Because it was proof. Proof that the damage had stuck, that the seed had grown, that it was no longer just his opinion, but now lived inside the unit, whispered into the background like a fact no one had the energy to dispute. That night, I walked home instead of driving. It took an hour. I didn't speak. I didn't listen to music. When I reached my apartment, I stood in the doorway for several minutes, unable to cross the threshold. I finally sat on the floor in the dark, still in uniform, still wearing the weight of a life that no longer felt mine. I thought about quitting, really quitting, not just the job, but the whole path, giving back the commendations, clearing out the locker, maybe even changing cities, starting over somewhere no one had heard the name Hart. But then, something strange happened. I looked at the badge on my shoulder. Not the rank, not the medal. Just the name, LT. J. Hart. And for the first time in weeks, I remembered something that didn't belong to him. My name, my body, my labor. I thought about my first deployment, the sand, the exhaustion, the quiet coordination I had led that helped move critical supplies through a route no one else had navigated before. No fanfare, no Instagram photo, just work, real work. And then I thought about my mother. She never wore a uniform. She wasn't written into the legacy stories my father told, but she held everything together. She was strength without medals, command without salutes. She used to say, "No one knows the roots, just the branches. Let them underestimate you." Sitting there in the dark, I repeated that line like a mantra. Let them underestimate me. That was the shift. Not rage, not revenge, but clarity. I would not disappear. I would not quit. But I would move differently, quietly, precisely. If they wanted silence, I'd give it to them. But it would be mine, not theirs. The shift wasn't visible to anyone at first. There was no speech, no grand rebuttal. Just a recalibration. I stopped trying to be seen and started choosing when and how I would reveal myself. My work hadn't changed, the assignments still came in, and I completed them. But I stopped volunteering for visibility. I focused instead on precision, excellence without spectacle. I paid closer attention to systems who moved information, who held quiet power, who people listened to when the microphones were off. I'd spent years being the kind of leader who made others comfortable. Now I studied the architecture of influence. And when I noticed gaps, logistical flaws, morale bottlenecks, breakdowns in chain of command clarity, I didn't raise alarms. I fixed them, quietly, efficiently, with no need for credit. I started logging patterns. A sergeant who overreported a junior's mistake but never logged his own. A captain who deferred to male lieutenants in meetings, even when their data was weaker. A staffer who called me ma'am with an edge as if it were both a title and a taunt. I didn't confront them, I documented them, not to retaliate, but to understand the terrain I was really navigating. In parallel, I made one discreet move. I requested a transfer not out of the command, but into a strategic planning division known for high-stakes work and low visibility. It was a quiet part of the base, away from ceremonies, speeches, social media profiles. But its influence rippled across operations in ways most never noticed. I didn't ask anyone for a recommendation. I submitted my credentials attached a case study I had compiled during a training mission 2 years earlier and let the work speak. I got the placement. In that new office, no one talked about the ceremony. No one called me a fraud. They just expected me to deliver. And I did. My days were long thick with metrics, risk assessments, and briefings. But they were also free of second-guessing glances and condescending nods. It was the first time in months I didn't feel like I was defending my existence just by showing up. Outside that office, my reputation remained in limbo. Some still tiptoed around me. Others assumed I'd been tucked away to avoid further embarrassment. I let them believe whatever made them feel superior, because I was rebuilding, not reacting. Around this time, I reached out to a woman I'd served with years earlier, now stationed overseas in a high-clearance intelligence role. We hadn't spoken in a while, but I remembered her clarity, her lack of pretense. I told her briefly what had happened and what I was trying to do now. She didn't say sorry. She said stay quiet, but stay in. We don't get to burn it down. We make space until it reshapes around us. I wrote that down. Weeks passed, then months. And slowly, I noticed something else. People started coming to me not publicly, but in whispers. A junior officer asked if I had a moment to explain a complicated personnel restructure. A peer asked if I would review his team's after-action report just to make sure it reads solid. Even my direct superior from the old command forwarded a logistics inquiry with a single line, "I think this falls under your expertise." They never apologized, never brought up my father, but their behavior had changed. Not because I had corrected the narrative, but because I had removed myself from their expectation of reaction and replaced it with undeniable competence. Eventually, one of the newer generals recently appointed and known for his ability to see past noise, invited me to co-author a confidential restructuring proposal for Joint Forces mobilization, a project that, if successful, would ripple across 3 commands. I said yes. We worked for 6 weeks. I presented the final draft, and when he reviewed it, he said nothing. Just nodded. Later that month, I received a sealed commendation internal only recognizing operational excellence and discretion. No ceremony, no cameras, just results. It was perfect, and yet, through it all, I hadn't forgotten the word the general had whispered to my father that day. I hadn't asked what it was, but I carried its weight, because that single word had cracked something open, not just in the room, but in me. Not a defense, not a rescue, but a reminder someone knew the truth. And that was enough for me to start building quietly again. It was a logistics review summit, formal, clean, and deceptively dull on the surface. A rotating podium of presentations, most delivered in clipped tones to an audience half distracted by their own prep materials. A place where ranks mingled, but hierarchy never disappeared. I hadn't planned to speak. I was there to observe and advise, seated in the second row, flanked by 2 officers from the restructuring task force. My name wasn't on the program. My badge just said Strategic Liaison. Then my name was called. The general who had assigned me the quiet commendation, the same one who had trusted me with the mobilization proposal, was now standing at the podium, calm, measured. Before we continue, he said Lieutenant Hart will present a 10-minute case on streamlined cross-command communications. You'll want to listen. He didn't ask. He didn't look around for approval. Just nodded at me once the same way he had when I earned my place, not through headlines, but through silent results. I stood up and walked to the front, not one murmur, not one sideways glance, except from the back of the room. My father was seated in the 4th row, 2 seats in from the aisle. I hadn't known he'd be attending. He was there as a guest consultant, part of a retired panel offering legacy perspectives. I registered the tension in my chest, the way my breath shortened just a fraction, but I didn't pause. The lights adjusted slightly as I reached the lectern. I placed my notes down. I didn't need them. "Good morning," I said, and the room went still. I presented the case clearly, outlining redundancies in communication between divisions, proposing solutions backed by metrics, ending with a 60-day implementation roadmap. Every line was purposeful, unemotional, rooted in work that had already begun. When I finished, there was a short pause, then a few nods. A clipped thank you from one of the observers, nothing dramatic, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of a recognition that didn't need applause. I stepped down, walked back to my seat, and then it happened. The general who had called me up leaned toward the microphone again. He looked out across the crowd, eyes scanning until they landed near my father. "I want to acknowledge," he said, "that the proposal Lieutenant Hart just outlined was foundational to the changes already being piloted under 3 commands. It was authored in full under her strategic direction following exemplary field evaluations." A pause, and then, almost too soft for the mic but loud enough for everyone to hear, "She is exactly what leadership looks like." That's when I saw it. My father's hands, gripping the edge of his folder just a little too tightly, his shoulders, once set high, no longer pulled back. He looked toward me just briefly. I didn't meet his eyes. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't stand. He said nothing. And that silence, that absence of protest, felt louder than anything he had ever shouted. The session moved forward, reports resumed, the routine returned. But the air had shifted, not just around me, around him. Because now the question wasn't whether I belonged, it was why he ever thought I didn't. I didn't ask what the general whispered that day, not at first. Weeks passed after the summit. My work continued, the task force expanded. I was rotated into a higher-level brief and then quietly tapped for an international coordination role. I said yes. No ceremony, just one signed memo. People began to refer to me by rank and title, not with hesitation, not with parentheses. My name entered rooms before I did, and it stayed there after I left. But the question lived inside me. What had he said to make my father go quiet, to make the room freeze? What word had been so precise, so devastating, that it pierced through years of dominance, doubt, and dismissal? I finally asked. We were walking through the north end of base after a briefing. It was near dusk, the light low the day long. The general carried no folder, just a slow, careful gait that matched mine. I didn't plan the question. I just asked, "Sir, that day, what did you say to him?" He stopped walking. Looked at me, not with surprise, but with a kind of patient gravity. "I told him," he said, "your daughter's file is thicker than yours ever was. That's all." And then he added one word. That's all I needed, thicker. He knew what it meant. I stood there, wind brushing past my collar. The weight of that word and what it contained settled into place. Thicker. A file not padded by stories or name or ceremony. A file filled with pages, briefs, evaluations, action, quiet wins, steady progress, evidence, proof. It wasn't just a defense. It was a declaration. Not "she's good enough," but "she's more." And my father had understood. That's why he never said another word. I hadn't seen him since the summit. He hadn't called. But a week later, I received a letter, no return address, only my name printed carefully. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the base circular. A 2-inch article about our task force's new initiative. My name was mentioned once. Folded into the paper was a photo. Old, faded. Me at 9 years old, wearing his old cap, saluting the mirror. Smiling. No note, no apology. Just a small act of acknowledgement. It wasn't enough to undo the past. But it didn't have to be. Because I didn't need him to rewrite the story. I had already written a better one. The real reveal wasn't in a podium announcement. It wasn't a thunderclap moment. It wasn't the general's whisper or the task force promotion. It was in the slow shift of perception, the quiet correction of an entire room that had once aligned with his accusation. They saw me now, not as the daughter of a veteran, not as the woman who got shouted at during a ceremony, not even as the one who stayed silent, but as the one who outlasted the noise, the one who didn't need to shout to prove she had built something worth hearing. My world didn't become easier. It just became clearer. People stopped doubting me aloud. But the residue of dismissal, the old habits of overlooking undercrediting, still hung around in corners. I noticed it less now. Or maybe it just mattered less, because I was no longer trying to prove myself to those who'd already made up their minds. I was building something beyond them. I moved into the new role, coordinating multi-branch responses across sectors, most of which would never see the spotlight. The decisions I helped shape affected thousands, from funding reallocations to personnel security protocols. I found purpose not in applause, but in precision. There was power in being necessary, but unseen. And as I grew into that space, I realized something else. The strongest influence doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from making them irrelevant to your trajectory. That included my father. We never reconciled, not formally. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't wait for it. But I heard through a mutual contact that he spoke of me differently now, that when people asked about his daughter, he no longer dismissed the topic. He no longer told the story of the ceremony. Instead, he said, "She's doing real work." I smiled when I heard that, not because I needed it, but because it meant he finally understood what I had always been doing even before he was willing to look. I built new relationships too, not out of survival, but alignment. I mentored 2 younger officers, both women, both sharp, both quietly watching the system. I didn't tell them what had happened to me. I just showed them what was possible. One day, one of them asked, "How do you keep your head down when people try to cut it off?" I said, "You don't. You lift it higher. Just don't speak until the silence is stronger than their noise. Years from now, they may never remember my name, but they'll stand taller. They'll know that strategy doesn't have to look loud." I've been asked to attend more ceremonies since then, this time not as a recipient, but as a leader. I rarely say yes, not out of bitterness, just preference. My work doesn't live on podiums, but if I do attend, I stand differently now. I don't wait for recognition. I don't brace for insult. I just occupy the space fully quietly. I became everything he said I wasn't, not in defiance, in purpose. And I've learned something I wish I could tell every woman who's ever been questioned by the very people meant to protect her. When they try to revoke your seat at the table, don't fight them for the chair. Build your own command center. Because the silence that follows your strength, that's the real applause.